At 3 a.m., the phone rang with a call that would shatter every carefully constructed lie in my marriage. My husband had collapsed. Not at home, not at work, but at the apartment of a woman wearing the exact silk pajamas I had bought for him as a couple's set. The wall clock in our bedroom glowed an unforgiving green. The smartphone on my nightstand erupted into a frantic, insistent ring that sliced through the silence of the high-rise apartment like a scalpel. A local landline number flashed across the screen. I answered on the second ring. A woman's urgent voice identified herself as the triage nurse at Chicago General Hospital Emergency Department. She asked me to confirm my name and my relationship to the patient, Adrian Kane. The moment I said I was his wife, the words tumbled out in a rush. Adrian had just been brought in by ambulance. He had collapsed. His heart rhythm was severely erratic. His blood pressure had plummeted. His life was in immediate danger. Old habits of a physician kicked in before emotion could. I demanded his core vitals, exact numbers for blood pressure, heart rate, and level of consciousness. The nurse answered, blood pressure 80-50 millimeters gears, heart rate over 130 beats per minute, the patient in a stupor, unresponsive to verbal commands. I instructed her to maintain the IV line and provide oxygen via face mask. She acknowledged and urged me to bring his ID, health insurance card, and come sign the admission paperwork immediately. I promised 20 minutes and hung up. I swung out of bed, the cold floorboards shocking my bare feet. In the closet, I grabbed a dark windbreaker and threw it over my cotton pajamas. From the desk drawer, I pulled the family medical file, Adrian's driver's license, and insurance card, stuffing them into my purse. My mind was already calculating. Adrian had never shown signs of structural heart disease. His physical 6 months earlier had been clean, normal blood pressure, normal cholesterol, no red flags. Yet something catastrophic had just happened. I locked the apartment door, took the elevator down, and stepped into a cold Chicago rain. The streets were deserted. Under the awning of our building, I opened the Uber app. A white sedan arrived in 2 minutes. I gave the driver the address for Chicago General and told him to take Lakeshore Drive. He nodded and accelerated into the night. City lights blurred past the fogged windows. The driver, a man in his 50s, asked what was wrong. I answered briefly. My husband had collapsed suddenly, cause unknown. The rest of the ride passed in silence, broken only by the rhythmic swipe of the wipers and the repeated failed calls I made to Adrian's phone, each one going straight to voicemail. 15 minutes later, the car pulled up to the emergency drop-off. I handed the driver a $100 bill, told him to keep the change, and pushed the door open into the wet night. Another ambulance's siren wailed nearby, red lights flashing against the white brick walls. I walked straight through the automatic glass doors of the ER. The triage area blazed under fluorescent lights. 2 clerks typed furiously at their computers. I approached, identified myself, and slid Adrian's license across the counter. The clerk entered the information and pointed down the hallway toward the intensive resuscitation bays. Nathaniel, no, Adrian Kane, was undergoing an emergency consult in Trauma Bay 3. The long corridor smelled of hospital bleach. Stretchers lined the walls. Exhausted family members slept on the floor or nodded off in blue plastic chairs. The rhythmic beep of ventilators and heart monitors drifted from partially open doors. At the end of the hall, I saw the double doors of the trauma bay closed tight. Outside them stood Walter and Margaret Kane, my parents-in-law, leaning against the glass and peering inside. The moment Margaret saw me, she lunged forward and grabbed both my arms, sobbing hysterically, crying her son's name. Walter turned, his face pale, arms hanging limp as he fumbled for the back of a chair. I helped Margaret into an empty plastic seat beside him, peeled her fingernails out of my skin, and demanded an update. Walter frantically shoved a crumpled admission paper into my hand. He said Adrian had been sleeping when he suddenly complained of severe chest pain, then rolled onto the floor and passed out. The people with him called 911. The trauma bay doors swung open. A burly male doctor in a white coat, badge reading Dr. Harris, attending our physician, stepped out and called for the family of Adrian Kane. I stood and identified myself as his wife. The doctor asked us to gather so he could explain. According to the initial clinical exam, Adrian had suffered a severe drop in blood pressure and had complained of chest pain radiating to his back before losing consciousness. Combining those symptoms, the ER team suspected a type A aortic dissection, a catastrophic tearing of the heart's main artery. Dr. Harris held out a blue clipboard and demanded that a family representative immediately sign the consent form for emergency open-chest surgery. The surgical team had been paged. OR3 was being prepped. Margaret leaped up, screaming, snatched the pen from the doctor's hand, and shoved it violently into mine. She ordered me to sign immediately so they could cut him open. Walter slammed his hand on the chair, urging me to sign before they missed the golden window to save his son. I held the pen and the consent form and scanned the pre-filled information. Diagnosis: suspected type A aortic dissection, pending labs. With years of experience in central cardiology, the data on that paper raised a barrage of red flags. Aortic dissection is almost always accompanied by a long history of severe hypertension or a connective tissue disorder, neither of which Adrian had. Diagnosing it solely on chest pain and low blood pressure without a chest CT or echocardiogram was reckless. I turned and asked Dr. Harris directly if there was a chest CT result or a blood chemistry panel yet. I demanded the blood pressure differential between the two arms and the results of the EKG. Dr. Harris frowned, clearly annoyed. The hospital's CT scanner was down for maintenance until morning. The EKG showed only non-specific wave changes. Blood had been drawn, but the lab hadn't uploaded the results yet. He stressed that the patient was deteriorating rapidly and the risk of cardiac tamponade was critical. If we stood around waiting for paperwork, the patient could die at any second. Margaret raised her hand and started smacking my shoulder, calling me a calculating, cold-hearted woman stalling with procedural nonsense while her son was dying. I stepped back, dodging her swinging hand, and folded the consent form. I told Dr. Harris firmly that I needed to see clinical evidence, or at least a blood panel, before I signed off on a thoracotomy. Cracking open the chest of a patient in shock with an unconfirmed cause was a massive violation of surgical safety protocols. The tense atmosphere in the hallway was broken by the sound of shuffling slippers from a dark corner of the waiting area. A young woman walked out clutching 2 plastic water bottles. She approached Walter, handed him a bottle with her head bowed, then looked at me. I scanned her from head to toe. Sienna Blake, the new admin assistant who had started at Adrian's company barely 3 months earlier. Her hair was a messy rat's nest. On her feet she wore cheap, worn-out plastic slides caked in mud. But the most glaring anomaly was what she was wearing: a pair of luxurious navy blue silk pajamas with a pale yellow geometric trim. That pattern and color exactly matched the men's sleepwear set Adrian usually wore at home, an exclusive design from a high-end boutique on Michigan Avenue that I had personally bought for us as a couple's set not long ago. The presence of a young female coworker at the hospital at 3 a.m., looking disheveled and wearing matching couple's pajamas with my husband, gave me a crystal-clear answer about exactly where this collapse had taken place. Noticing me staring at her clothes, Sienna awkwardly tried to smooth the wrinkles in her silk top and stepped back, hiding behind Margaret. Margaret pulled her forward and told me that thanks to this kind coworker who noticed Adrian fainting, the ambulance was called in time. I ignored Margaret and took a step forward, directly facing Sienna. In a razor-sharp tone, I asked why she was with my husband at 3 a.m. and why his collapse happened at her apartment. Sienna wrung her hands together, staring at the floor, too terrified to look me in the eye. She mumbled that Adrian had stopped by to pick up some documents for the new real estate project. While reviewing them, he suddenly felt sick, asked to sit inside for a moment, and then collapsed on the floor. Hearing that pathetic excuse, I pointed directly at the shiny silk pajamas she was wearing. The new real estate project was finalized last week. What documents needed to be handed over at midnight? I pressed further. What company policy allows a female employee to host her boss at her apartment wearing nothing but silk pajamas? Describe exactly how he collapsed. Did he hit his head? Did he seize? Did he lose consciousness immediately or gradually? Startled, Sienna stumbled backward, tripping over the leg of a plastic chair and nearly falling. She stammered, completely unable to answer basic medical questions about the fainting episode. Margaret immediately grabbed Sienna's shoulders. Glaring at me, she screamed that her son's life was hanging by a thread. Instead of signing the paper to save him, I was standing there acting like a jealous maniac over absolute nonsense. Walter stood up to back his wife, criticizing me for being a petty, narrow-minded woman who couldn't prioritize. The crowd of bystanders in the ER started turning their heads, whispering and pointing. Dr. Harris slammed his hand against the clipboard, demanding the family keep it down, and gave me an ultimatum on the surgical consent. Seeing my absolute refusal, Margaret lunged forward, snatched the pen, grabbed my right wrist, and tried to force the pen into my palm. She cursed at me, calling me a wicked daughter-in-law who was calculating her inheritance. While her husband hovered between life and death, she declared that if Adrian died, she would make me pay with my life. Her grip was insanely tight. Her acrylic nails dug into my skin, drawing blood. Using my left hand, I pried her fingers off me one by one and took 2 steps back to maintain a safe distance. Seeing that physical force wouldn't work, Walter stepped forward, changing his tactic to a desperate, pleading tone. He said Adrian was their only son, the sole heir to the Kane name, and begged me to put aside my personal suspicions to save a life. He promised that whatever happened between Adrian and Sienna, he would handle it personally once Adrian was safe. His words were laced with intense moral manipulation, trying to paint me as a monster if I continued to refuse. Hiding behind Margaret, Sienna started wiping away fake tears. She let out a dramatic sob, looked at the doctor, and loudly accused me. She's always been cold to him. She never cared about how hard Adrian works. And now she's just using this as an excuse to let him die. Sienna stepped toward the triage desk, telling the doctor that if the cold-blooded wife wouldn't sign, she would sign it herself as his coworker to take responsibility. Sienna's theatrical performance pushed the outrage of the onlookers to a peak. Dr. Harris banged his pen against the metal desk, demanding an end to the argument. He sternly explained the legalities. By law, only a spouse, a biological parent, or a child over 18 can sign a surgical consent. No outsider can sign it. He looked dead at me, delivering his final warning. OR3 was prepped. The anesthesiologist was waiting. If I didn't sign in the next 5 minutes, he would note in the chart that the family refused medical intervention, and the hospital would bear zero responsibility when the patient died. Ignoring the surrounding criticism and the immense pressure, I maintained complete composure. I replied to Dr. Harris that I was not refusing treatment. I was refusing to let them saw through a man's sternum without a single shred of solid clinical evidence. Administering general anesthesia to a patient in shock with an unknown cause would lead to irreversible cardiovascular collapse. I demanded the doctor give me Adrian's patient ID number printed on the temporary admission receipt. Walter pulled a pink receipt from his chest pocket and handed it to me. I took the paper, reached into my purse, and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and accessed the Epic electronic health record system, which was integrated with the new statewide AI healthcare database. This was a real-time data analysis system recently deployed by the Department of Health. I typed the patient ID into the search bar, then entered my own phone number to receive the OTP verification code. The moment I entered the 6 digits, the screen transitioned to Adrian Kane's medical chart. The AI system had just finished syncing the data from the hematology lab. The screen was flooded with biochemical and hematological metrics. Blazing across my screen were bright red highlight bars, critical danger alerts automatically flagged by the AI. I pinched the screen to zoom in, my eyes scanning the core indicators. Adrian's potassium, K, level was at 2.8 mmol, an insanely low number compared to the normal range of 3.5-5.1. His sodium Na had spiked to 158 mmol, indicating severe hypernatremia. Scrolling down, his kidney functions were flashing red. His serum creatinine was 2.5 milligrams dsdl, triple the normal limit, confirming the patient was in acute kidney injury. His blood was severely concentrated, shown by a hematocrit spiking to 55. Arterial blood gas showed a pH of 7.52 and bicarbonate, HCO3, at 35 mg/L, proving severe metabolic alkalosis. Most importantly, I looked for the cardiac markers to check the ER doctor's diagnosis. His troponin I, a specific cardiac enzyme, was under 0.01 ng/mL, completely normal. The D-dimer test, the gold standard to rule out blood clots and aortic dissection, was also negative. With my deep foundational knowledge of internal cardiology, I instantly pieced the clinical picture together. Adrian did not have an aortic dissection or any structural heart damage. The sudden plunge in potassium to 2.8 had destabilized the electrical physiology of his myocardial cells. This directly caused the severe arrhythmias, dropping his cardiac output, which led to the low blood pressure, chest pain, and fainting. The high sodium, high hematocrit, and acute kidney failure were absolute proof that his body had been drained of a massive amount of water in a very short period, pulling a severely dehydrated, hypokalemic patient in shock onto an operating table and injecting IV anesthetics would permanently stop his heart. No amount of chest compressions would bring him back. Gripping the phone, I turned to Walter. Knowing he was a retired high school teacher, far more logical and calm than Margaret. I chose him to receive the information. I shoved the phone screen, glowing with red critical alerts, right into his face. My voice was cold and resonant, enunciating every word. Walter, please look at the numbers on your son's blood work before you force me to sign him over to a surgeon. Walter squinted at the screen, sheer panic washing over his face at the sight of all the red warnings. I pointed at the word potassium, explaining clearly that Adrian's potassium levels had dropped to a lethal threshold. This severe electrolyte deficiency was the actual culprit causing his heart muscles to spasm, triggering the chest pain and the collapse. I then pointed to the troponin and D-dimer, emphasizing that the blood chemistry completely ruled out a ruptured heart vessel. I declared that Adrian was suffering from acute kidney injury and severe metabolic alkalosis due to extreme dehydration. Speaking with the absolute authority of my profession, I stated that putting Adrian on the operating table right now was a death sentence. The anesthesia would knock out his severely potassium-deprived heart on the very first injection. Hearing my articulate clinical breakdown, both Walter and Margaret stood frozen, completely speechless. Sienna backed up against the chairs, the color draining from her face. I turned to face Dr. Harris, looking straight into the attending's eyes. I ordered him to log into the hospital's computer system immediately and check the blood work himself. I loudly and officially refused to sign the thoracotomy consent form. Instead, I demanded the ER team immediately cancel the OR. I issued emergency protocol orders, established 2 large-bore IV lines, push 0.9% normal saline at maximum rate to combat hypovolemic shock, and start a slow IV drip of potassium chloride via a syringe pump with continuous cardiac monitoring. Dr. Harris stood rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with shock at hearing highly specialized medical directives fired off by a woman who had just been branded a jealous housewife. He rushed back to the desk and furiously typed the patient ID into his computer. The hospital monitor displayed the exact same lab results I had on my phone. Breaking out in a cold sweat, Dr. Harris grabbed the landline and frantically called OR3, ordering them to stand down and cancel the surgery. The atmosphere in the hallway instantly flipped. Slamming the phone down, Dr. Harris practically ran out from behind the desk. He looked at me, his attitude completely revolutionized from 10 minutes ago. He confirmed that the lab had just pushed the detailed results. He admitted his initial clinical diagnosis was flawed and agreed that the severe hypokalemia was the true life-threatening issue. He immediately turned and barked orders at the 2 nurses behind him to execute the emergency protocols I had just laid out. I tossed the surgical consent form back to him. Dr. Harris took his pen and wrote clearly, "Refused thoracotomy due to lack of supporting clinical evidence," and signed my name at the bottom. Handing it back, I demanded he open Trauma Bay 3 so I could personally oversee Adrian's electrolyte replacement. Dr. Harris nodded, pushing open the frosted double doors. I strode inside, leaving Walter, Margaret, and Sienna cemented to the floor in the hallway. Inside, Adrian lay motionless on the stainless steel gurney, the oxygen resuscitator bag still strapped to his face, pumping rhythmically. The monitor by his head flashed with green and red waveforms. My eyes glued to the EKG strip running across the screen. The QRS complexes were wide, the T waves were flat, and prominent U waves had appeared. These were textbook physiological signs of severe potassium depletion, destroying the heart's stability. The blood pressure read 85/55 millimeters Hertzgear. His heart rate was still hovering at 125. A nurse wheeled a crash cart over, swiftly tearing the plastic off an IV kit. I stood right next to her, reminding her to use an 18-gauge catheter to ensure maximum flow rate. The nurse nodded, tied the tourniquet tight around Adrian's left bicep, swabbed the skin with alcohol, and slid the needle straight into a large vein. The moment blood flashed in the chamber, she retracted the needle, pushed the catheter in, and taped it down. A 500-milliliter bag of 0.9% normal saline was hung on the pole. The valve opened to maximum to rapidly elevate his blood pressure. On his right arm, another nurse was establishing a second line. Dr. Harris stepped up, holding two 10-milliliter vials of 10% potassium chloride. He personally mixed the medication into a large cinch pump, setting the parameters for a slow IV drip. I scrutinized the LCD screen on the pump, confirming the rate was set exactly at 10 mg/week per hour. Pushing high-concentration potassium directly into a peripheral vein carries a high risk of phlebitis. But in a state of electrolyte shock, it was the only way to keep his heart from stopping. The beep-beep of the syringe pump began its steady rhythm. I stood silently with my arms crossed next to the gurney, my eyes never leaving the monitor. The first 10 minutes ticked by in agonizing tension. The automatic cuff inflated around Adrian's arm every 5 minutes. By minute 15, the numbers began to shift. The blood pressure crept from 85/55 to 90/60. His heart rate dropped from 125 down to 115. The waveforms on the EKG began to narrow, the U waves fading. Dr. Harris let out a massive sigh of relief. He pulled a handkerchief from his white coat and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He turned to me, his voice laced with obvious caution and deep respect. He asked which hospital I was affiliated with. Seeing as I could read myocardial physiology perfectly and dictate a hypokalemia protocol with such absolute authority, I didn't answer him right away. I checked the monitor one last time, ensuring Adrian's hemodynamics were temporarily out of the woods, then turned and pushed through the doors, back into the hallway. The moment the double doors closed behind me, I was met with a fresh wave of hostility. Sienna had recovered from her initial shock. Seeing me walk out without Adrian, she instantly lunged forward, blocking the hallway. She pointed a trembling finger right in my face, her shrill voice echoing off the walls. She accused me of being a cold-blooded murderer, using some medical jargon I read online to stop a real doctor from saving a life. She turned to Margaret, fueling the fire, claiming I was intentionally dragging out the clock so Adrian would die and I could steal the inheritance. Margaret, easily manipulated, immediately backed her up. She shoved my shoulder hard, screaming that she was going into that room to see her son. She berated me, calling me a pathetic unemployed housewife who leeched off her husband all year, demanding to know what right I had to boss around doctors. She declared that if Adrian didn't make it, she'd drag me to court for medical obstruction. Walter stood by, doing nothing to stop his wife, merely staring at me with suspicion, waiting for an explanation. Dr. Harris pushed the doors open right then, about to step in and defend me, but I raised my hand to stop him. I stood my ground, not reacting to Margaret's shove. Slowly, I unzipped my purse, reached into the small interior pocket, and pulled out a heavy-duty plastic ID badge secured in a clear leather holder. The front of the badge bore a bold red medical insignia, and below it, crisp capitalized letters. I raised the badge right to Margaret and Sienna's eye level. Looking at Walter, my voice calm but lethal, I read aloud every single word printed on the card. Dr. Elena Voss, MD, PhD, Chief of Cardiology Research, National Heart Institute. I flipped the badge over, revealing the official Department of Health watermark and the signature of the hospital's Chief of Medicine. I shoved the badge inches from Sienna's face and asked her if these words looked like something I had read online. Sienna's eyes bulged out of her skull, her jaw dropping open without a sound. She stumbled backward, her aggression instantly dissolving into absolute terror. Margaret froze, the hand that had just shoved me hovering midair. She squinted, struggling to read the text on the badge, her face morphing from pure rage to complete bewilderment. Walter stepped forward quickly, snatching the badge from my hand to get a closer look. Seeing the official seals and the title of PhD, his hands began to shake. He looked at me, stammering, asking why. For the past 8 years, Adrian had told the family I was just a part-time contract typist at a local clinic making minimum wage. Dr. Harris, hearing the title, immediately stepped forward. He bowed his head slightly, greeting me with the profound respect reserved for a colleague of a much higher rank. He confirmed to my in-laws that the National Heart Institute was the premier medical facility in the country, a place where only the absolute top experts in the field were given chief of research positions. The confirmation from the attending physician was like a bucket of ice water to Margaret and Walter's faces. I took my badge back and carefully returned it to my purse. I looked straight into Walter's eyes and answered him clearly. I explained that Adrian had hidden his wife's true identity from his family and his coworkers because of his massive inferiority complex. He was a man whose fragile ego couldn't accept a wife who made significantly more money and held a much higher degree than he did. Adrian had constructed a perfect facade of a highly successful husband providing for a weak, uneducated housewife just to stroke his own ego, and to maintain that delusion, he needed the fake flattery of inferior, subservient girls like Sienna. Every eye in the hallway was now locked on the admin assistant standing there in her shiny silk pajamas. The revelation of my credentials completely obliterated Sienna's arrogance and Margaret's elitist attitude, but I wasn't going to give them a second to breathe. I moved in, digging deep into the logical holes of their little emergency story. I pivoted, backing Sienna up until her spine hit the cold tile wall. I want you to answer these questions directly. Real timeline, no dodging, no fake tears. I pulled out my phone, reopened the Epic app, and switched to the EMS dispatch notes. I read aloud, 911 call received at 2:45 a.m. Paramedics arrived on scene at 2:55 a.m. EMTs noted the patient was unconscious and showing signs of extreme dehydration upon arrival. I put the phone away, crossed my arms, and began the interrogation. I asked Sienna why she lied to the doctor, claiming Adrian suddenly felt tired and fell over. A state of acute kidney failure and metabolic alkalosis caused by dehydration takes hours to develop. I demanded to know why Adrian's clothes weren't soaked in sweat, yet his body was so drained of fluids that his blood had condensed to a 55% hematocrit level. I kept going. Why was Adrian at the apartment of a girl who's only worked there for 3 months in the middle of the night? And why are you wearing matching couple's pajamas with my husband? Sienna covered her face with her hands, mumbling incoherent nonsense. Her fingers gripped the silk fabric, desperately trying to pull the collar up to hide her neck. I took another step forward, crushing her with clinical precision. If he collapsed suddenly like she claimed, why weren't there any bruises on his head or body from hitting the floor? I demanded she confess the exact amount of time from when Adrian first complained of chest pain to the moment she actually dialed 911. The razor-sharp medical interrogation combined with the dispatch timeline shattered Sienna completely. She couldn't invent a single medical excuse to cover her lies. Her legs gave out. Her cheap plastic slide skidded on the wet tile floor. She collapsed onto the ground, burying her face in her knees, sobbing hysterically, utterly incapable of looking at anyone. Seeing Sienna's panic and total breakdown, Walter and Margaret finally understood exactly what had happened. That missing 20 minutes from the moment Adrian got sick to the moment the ambulance was called. That was the time Sienna spent desperately trying to cover up a crime scene. She had cleaned him up, redressed him, and tried to wake him to avoid getting caught. It was only when Adrian went completely blue, his pulse fading, that the sheer terror of having a dead body in her apartment forced her to call 911. The lie about handing over real estate documents was brutally dissected and laid bare by a medical professional. Having witnessed the entire interrogation, Margaret finally grasped that her son had committed an unforgivable sin and was currently surviving in the ER solely because of his wife's brilliance. Her demeanor flipped entirely. She hurried over, clutching her hands to her chest, and grabbed the fabric of my windbreaker. She lowered her voice, pleading with me to let everything go, to use my connections in the medical field to get the best doctors to save Adrian. She repeated over and over that Adrian was the only heir to the Kane family name. If anything happened to him, she wouldn't survive it. Her pathetic begging was a stark contrast to the 8 years of contempt she had shown me. Hearing her mention the family heir, I peeled her trembling hands off my jacket. I stepped back, standing tall, and looked my mother-in-law dead in the eye. I asked Margaret, "Do you remember the day I gave birth to Lila at the maternity ward 5 years ago?" That day, when the nurse brought out a swaddled newborn and announced it was a girl, Margaret stared for exactly 1 minute, picked up her bag, and walked right out of the hospital. She abandoned me, freshly out of a C-section, leaving my own mother to handle the bills and the paperwork. She didn't show up again until the day of discharge, dropping a cold comment that I manipulated him into having a kid to trap his finances, completely ignoring her own granddaughter. In 5 years, she hadn't bought her granddaughter a single toy or bottle of formula. I brought up the wedding. 8 years ago, my working-class family had scraped together $2,000 to help pay for the backyard wedding. For years, at every Thanksgiving and family dinner, Margaret loudly mocked that number. She told everyone how poor my family was, how pathetic it was that we could barely afford a cheap catered buffet. She constantly used my Midwestern blue-collar roots to degrade my value, completely ignoring the fact that the down payment for the luxury Lincoln Park condo Adrian and I currently lived in came entirely from a secret trust fund my grandmother left me. Walter stared at the ground as I exposed them. He always prided himself on being an educated, dignified retired teacher. Yet he allowed his wife to verbally abuse his daughter-in-law and enabled his son's toxic misogyny. At family gatherings, I was always left to run around stressed, doing all the cooking, serving, and cleaning for Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, Adrian just sat on the couch with his dad, drinking scotch and watching the NFL game, soaking up their praise. For 8 years, I endured it. I hid my PhD and my massive income to protect my husband's fragile ego and his pride. That sacrifice was repaid with my husband's blatant betrayal and his parents' relentless bullying. And today, in this hospital corridor, the mother-in-law, infected with a deeply patriarchal mindset, was forced to lower herself and beg the very woman she despised. I looked Margaret in the eyes and stated clearly that saving a patient's life is a doctor's sworn duty. But my time as a daughter-in-law to the Kane family officially ended tonight. Hearing that, Margaret collapsed into a plastic chair, covering her face, weeping silently. Right as she cried, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from down the hall. A man in his 50s, wearing a white coat over green surgical scrubs, marched quickly toward the ER desk. His badge read Dr. Kevin, chief of the intensive care unit. Behind him, 2 nurses pushed a transport gurney equipped with a large oxygen tank and a portable monitor. Arriving at the desk, Dr. Kevin received a rapid-fire report from Dr. Harris. When he looked up toward the trauma bay, he immediately recognized me. Dr. Kevin walked over briskly and extended his hand. He greeted me warmly as Dr. Voss, chief of cardiology research, and asked what on earth I was doing in the ER at dawn. I shook his hand briefly, explaining that my family member was inside, and outlined the severe hypokalemia diagnosis. Hearing the pathology, Dr. Kevin walked straight to the computer and pulled up the lab results. Putting on his reading glasses, he stared at the wall of red alerts. Seconds later, he loudly reprimanded Dr. Harris right in front of the family. He criticized the ER team for ignoring core biochemistry and recklessly ordering a thoracotomy for a patient in hypovolemic shock, calling it a catastrophic medical error. If the family hadn't intervened, the hospital would have had a fatality on the operating table. Dr. Kevin typed on the keyboard, officially canceling the OR hold. He signed the order to transfer Adrian Kane to the ICU to continue the electrolyte replacement protocol and treat the acute kidney injury. With the internal transfer ordered, the ER team kicked into high gear. Dr. Harris rapidly printed charts while the nurses wheeled the transport gurney into the room. The transfer required seamless coordination. I stood by the glass watching the nurses move the IV lines from the old bed to the new IV poles. The potassium syringe pump was locked onto the bed rail, ensuring the 10-meter drip never stopped. The portable oxygen was connected to Adrian's mask. Once the vitals stabilized on the portable screen, they rolled the gurney out. Adrian lay motionless, his face ghostly pale under the lights. Tubes covered his arms as the gurney rolled down the long hallway toward the trauma elevators. The elevator dinged at the third floor of the ICU. The metal doors opened, and the nurses pushed Adrian through the automated sterile glass doors. Only authorized medical personnel were allowed past this point. I, along with Walter and Margaret, was forced to stop at the family waiting room. It was dead silent, save for the hum of the ceiling AC unit. Margaret walked over to a cold stainless steel bench and slumped down. Walter sat next to her, arms resting on his knees, staring blankly at the floor. They were completely silent. Neither dared to say a word to defend their son or his little admin assistant. I scanned the waiting area. Sienna was gone. I asked a passing custodian if she had seen her. The custodian replied that about 15 minutes ago, right when the ICU chief arrived, she saw a girl in pajamas and bare feet sprinting toward the hospital exit. Sienna had chosen to run the second my true identity, and the reality of her medical cover-up were exposed. I didn't care that she ran. I walked over to the thick reinforced glass wall separating the waiting room from the ICU bays. Through the glass, I easily spotted bed 5 where Adrian was lying. The central ventilator was pushing oxygen into his lungs. The monitor above his bed continuously traced his vitals. Even through the glass, the numbers were crystal clear to a doctor. His blood pressure was up to 165 millimeters Higgers. His heart rate had dropped to 105. The EKG waves were narrowing significantly, showing that the potassium replacement was saving his heart from seizing. Time crawled by in the darkness. I stood frozen in front of the glass, my hands shoved deep into my windbreaker pockets. The chill of the AC blowing on me was nothing compared to the absolute coldness in my mind. 8 years of marriage, I had poured my entire soul into building this family, stepping into the shadows to become a ghost just to protect my husband's ego. In return, he was perfectly willing to trample on that sacrifice, sneaking around with another woman and risking his own life for a pathetic affair. My watch read 5 a.m. The harsh streetlights outside the hospital windows began to yield to the dim gray light of dawn. The illusion of a happy family had completely shattered tonight. I pulled my eyes away from the monitor, walked over to the water cooler, and drank a full cup to chase away the exhaustion of a sleepless night. The medical data confirmed Adrian had survived the critical phase. My role as a doctor was done. This morning would be the beginning of the end for this miserable marriage. At exactly 8 news a.m., the ICU intercom crackled to life and called for the family of Adrian Kane. I stood up from the steel bench, rolling my stiff shoulders to work out the knots that had formed during the long hours of standing watch. Walter and Margaret, who had finally fallen into a restless, leaning sleep against each other, jolted awake as if the voice had struck them physically. They scrambled to their feet and followed me toward the isolation doors, like two people walking to their own sentencing. An ICU nurse stepped out wearing full protective gear. She announced that the patient had been successfully extubated. His vitals were stable and he was fully conscious. Per ICU rules, only one family member was allowed to put on PPE and visit for exactly 15 minutes. Margaret tried to push past me, her voice rising in that familiar entitled pitch. I blocked her with my forearm without looking at her. I told the nurse calmly and clearly that I was his wife and, as a medical doctor, I needed to personally assess his cognitive function. The nurse nodded once, handed me a disposable isolation gown, a hairnet, and a surgical mask, and stepped aside. I geared up with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. I sanitized my hands, pushed through the sterile doors, and entered the controlled world of the ICU. The air smelled aggressively of antibiotics, layered over the relentless electronic beeping of machines. Soft fluorescent light washed everything in a clinical white that made the shadows feel sharper. Approaching bed 5, I stopped at the foot of the bed where the paper chart was clipped. Adrian lay on his back, propped up on pillows. The heavy oxygen mask was gone, replaced by a simple nasal cannula providing low-flow oxygen. His eyes were wide open, darting around the ceiling and the tubes sticking out of his arms. Hearing the soft rustle of my PPE, he turned his head, his eyes locked onto mine. The exhaustion of a man who had just survived death was rapidly replaced by sheer, suffocating panic. He quickly looked away, dodging my gaze, his hands bruised and filled with IV needles, twitched against the thin hospital blanket. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was so dry that only a raspy cough came out. I pulled a stainless steel stool closer to the bed and sat down. Instead of asking how he felt like a normal wife, I reached over and took the medical chart. I flipped through the pages, scanning the second metabolic panel drawn at 6 a.m. Potassium was up to 3.4 mmol, sodium was dropping. Kidney function was beginning to recover. Medically speaking, the emergency protocol I had ordered had worked flawlessly. I closed the chart and placed it on the tray table. Crossing my arms, I stared directly at Adrian's pale face. My voice echoed in the quiet bay, even and flat, devoid of a single drop of emotion. State your full name, date of birth, and current location. He hesitated, then answered perfectly in a raspy whisper. Recognizing that his mind was completely intact, I shifted to the real reason I had entered the room. I reached into the pocket of my isolation gown and pulled out a small Ziploc bag. Inside were several capsules, half green, half pale yellow, with no branding, no labels, no ingredient list. I had found them in the back of his desk drawer at 3 a.m. while frantically searching for his ID and insurance card. I held the bag up at his eye level. Explain exactly what these are. Seeing the bag, Adrian flinched hard. Absolute terror flooded his eyes, his pupils constricted. He turned his head away and muttered, "They're just normal vitamin supplements from the pharmacy." I slammed my hand down on the metal tray table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the quiet bay. I raised my voice just enough to cut through any remaining denial, hitting him with precise pharmacology. These are not vitamins. These are black market diet pills loaded with sibutramine, a banned substance, and massive doses of hardcore diuretics. When you take them, they force your kidneys into overdrive, flushing out water and vital minerals through your urine to fake weight loss. Taking these continuously drained all the potassium from your blood, caused a severe arrhythmia, and put you into hypovolemic shock last night. I demanded he confess exactly how long he had been taking them, and why he had been hiding this poison from me. Adrian lay in silence, eyes red. The ironclad medical breakdown left absolutely zero room for lies. He whispered the confession. He had been taking them for 2 weeks. He didn't buy them at a pharmacy. Sienna, the admin girl, introduced him to them and bought them off some shady online shop. She bragged that her friends used them to stay skinny. Drunk on her flattery, he had secretly popped 2 a day, desperate to look lean and handsome for her. I pulled out my phone, opened the photo I had snapped of Sienna standing in the ER hallway, and shoved it in his face. The picture clearly showed her messy hair and the navy blue silk pajamas, the exact match to his. I asked why he was at a 22-year-old's apartment at 3 a.m., and why his body was so dehydrated he nearly died, Adrian stared at the photo, completely drained of color. He opened his mouth, desperately searching for an excuse, but found nothing. Under the relentless barrage of medical evidence and photographic proof, his last wall of defense crumbled. He began to sob. Tears rolled down his pale cheeks. The truth of his collapse finally spilled out in broken pieces. He confessed he had gone to Sienna's apartment to get more diet pills. They took them together. Then they had sex. The side effects of the drugs combined with the extreme physical exertion utterly destroyed his body. He felt his heart racing out of control, couldn't breathe, broke into a cold sweat, and passed out. The missing 20 minutes I had deduced was exactly when Sienna was desperately trying to dress him and wipe away the evidence before calling 911. The confession of betrayal came straight from the mouth of a husband lying on a hospital bed. Adrian didn't dare look at me. His eyes stayed glued to the white blanket. The sound of his pathetic hiccups broke the silence of the room. Instead of screaming or insulting him, I sat perfectly still on the stool, hands folded in my lap. I wanted to hear every single twisted justification he had for this disgusting betrayal. Seeing me not react, Adrian thought I was softening. He tried to lean forward, extending an ivy-bruised arm to grab the sleeve of my isolation gown. He started justifying his actions with a wildly distorted logic. He blamed me. He said that for 8 years, my brilliance and my massive medical degree had created an invisible, crushing weight on his shoulders. Even though I had played the role of a quiet typist to protect his pride, deep down he had always felt inferior, suffocated by my success. He claimed he needed a place where he could feel like a real man, a provider, someone whose voice mattered. Sienna, uneducated and low income, was exactly where he found that fix. She constantly praised him, telling him how smart, handsome, and rich he was. That fake worship was a drug, making him so blind he threw away his family and risked his life just to feed his fragile ego. Taking the black market pills was just to keep up appearances for his young mistress. Hearing him blame his own wife for his cheating, I let out a dry, hollow laugh. My silent sacrifice, hiding my PhD for years to protect his manhood, had ultimately become his excuse to cheat. I swatted his hand away from my sleeve and stood up from the stool, taking a large step back to create distance. I looked right into his eyes and dissected his cowardice without raising my voice. Your inferiority didn't come from me being too excellent. It came from you being a mediocre coward who refused to work hard. Instead of fighting to be worthy of your wife and daughter, you chose to drag your wife down to your level and seek out inferior women so you could delude yourself into feeling powerful. Today is the inevitable result of your lies, your selfishness, and your sheer stupidity. Lying in this bed, fighting death, is the price you paid for your lust and your absolute ignorance in pumping poison into your own body, Adrian wailed. He pressed his hands together, begging for forgiveness. He brought up Lila, pleading with me to think of our 5-year-old daughter and forgive this one mistake. He promised to cut Sienna off completely, throw away the pills, and be a good husband and father. His desperate pleas echoed in the sterile room and carried absolutely zero weight with me. I stood with my arms crossed at the foot of his bed, my voice ice cold. My presence here last night, stopping a lethal surgery and ordering the potassium drip, was my professional duty as an emergency physician. It had absolutely nothing to do with a wife's love or forgiveness for a traitor. If it hadn't been for the hospital's AI-integrated database flagging your potassium, and if I hadn't used my medical authority to stop the surgical team, your heart would have stopped the second the anesthesia hit your veins. Your lust, your addiction to cheap flattery, and your lies dragged you to the gates of hell. You gambled your life and your daughter's happiness for a few hours of cheap thrills with an admin assistant. Your promises now are just the temporary panic of a man who had barely escaped the Grim Reaper. There is no genuine remorse. The respect and trust I had for you over the last 8 years were entirely pulverized. They can never be rebuilt. Adrian reached out again, trying to grab my PPE gown. I stepped far out of reach. I checked my watch and announced that the 15-minute ICU visitation window was officially over. I stated clearly that my medical obligation ended right here. He was past the danger zone, his vitals were stable, and his continued care was now the ICU staff's problem. I turned and walked straight toward the sterile doors. As Adrian screamed my name over and over from the bed, I didn't look back once. I pushed through the glass doors and out into the waiting room. I carefully stripped off the disposable gown, hairnet, and mask, tossing them into the yellow biohazard bin. Every emotional and legal obligation I had to the man in that room died the second those doors closed. Stepping out of the restricted zone, I took the Ziploc bag of diet pills and placed it on the ICU central desk. Dr. Kevin was sitting there reviewing charts. He looked up. I gave him a highly detailed report on my findings regarding the source of the patient's severe hypokalemia and kidney failure. I presented the pills, explaining they contained banned sibutramine and extreme diuretics illegally distributed online. Dr. Kevin took the bag, squinting at the unmarked capsules. He nodded, highly praising my rapid pharmacological deduction. The circulation of these black market supplements was a massive public health crisis that had already caused multiple cases of renal failure and strokes in major hospitals. He agreed to cooperate with me to document the evidence for an official medical investigation. I pulled out my phone and opened my camera. I took high-resolution macro shots of the pills from multiple angles, ensuring the batch numbers, if any, and the ER admission paperwork were in the frame. I informed Dr. Kevin that in my capacity as Chief of Cardiology Research at the National Heart Institute, I would be filing an extensive adverse event report directly to the FDA and the State Medical Board, complete with all blood panels. This report would demand an immediate sweep of the illegal distributors selling this poison. Furthermore, I noted that I would be reporting Sienna's actions. She had supplied a banned substance and intentionally delayed, calling 911 for 20 minutes to cover up an affair while a man was dying. Delaying emergency medical care for a patient in severe shock could easily constitute gross criminal negligence and reckless endangerment under state law. Dr. Kevin fully supported my decision. He signed the chain of custody form for the pills, sealed the Ziploc in a biohazard evidence box, and flagged it for the hospital's toxicology lab. Seeing that box locked in the cabinet brought me a cold, precise peace. The reckless, illegal actions of Sienna, combined with Adrian's sheer stupidity, would now face the full force of federal regulators and the law. Leaving the ICU desk, I walked back out to the main family waiting area. The morning sun was pouring through the hallway windows in hard, clear shafts. Walter and Margaret were still huddled on the steel benches. Seeing me, Margaret practically jumped up. She was holding a white paper bag and rushing toward me. The arrogant, demanding monster from last night was entirely gone, replaced by a fawning, pathetic old woman. She pulled out a toasted bagel with cream cheese and an iced latte she had bought from the hospital cafeteria. Holding them out with both hands, she flashed a sickeningly sweet smile and begged me to eat breakfast to regain my strength after a long night. She lowered her voice to a whisper, trying to excuse Adrian's cheating. She claimed that men sometimes stray when they are stressed, and it was entirely the fault of that young harlot for seducing her son. She begged me to be the bigger person, to forgive and forget, to raise Lila together, and to protect the Kane family reputation. Walter stepped up to agree with his wife. He promised he would personally discipline Adrian and force him to go to couples therapy and do whatever it took to win my trust back. He suggested that this weekend they would bring Lila over, and we could have a big family dinner to put this whole ugly night behind us. This total 180 in their attitude didn't come from genuine regret. It came from absolute terror. They now knew I was a highly respected MD, PhD with immense social standing, and they realized their son was facing serious legal and medical fallout. I stood completely still, looking at the cold bagel and the melting ice in the latte. I raised my hand, politely but firmly rejecting the food. In a calm voice, I informed them that Adrian was officially out of danger and being well taken care of by the ICU team. I didn't bother arguing or exposing the blatant hypocrisy in their words. In my mind, The decision to annihilate this 8-year marriage was now as solid as concrete. A family built on a husband's lies and in-laws' toxic misogyny was rotten to the core. Any forced reconciliation would only destroy my dignity and poison my daughter's future. I gave Walter and Margaret a curt, professional goodbye, turned on my heel, and walked straight to the elevators to leave the hospital. Outside, the morning air was sharp and clean after the rain. I stood on the wet sidewalk for a moment, breathing it in. The city was waking up around me. Cars, distant horns, the ordinary noise of people who still believed their lives were intact. I pulled out my phone and opened a secure note. I typed a single line to my attorney: draft no-fault divorce petition. Primary custody of Lila. Full equity of the Lincoln Park condo in exchange for silence on the illegal substances. Ready for signature within 48 hours. I hit send, then I ordered a car and went home to my daughter. The sleepless night was over. The real work of reclaiming my life had just begun. The car moved through the wet Chicago streets in silence. Rain still clung to the sidewalks in thin, shining sheets. I sat in the back seat with my head against the window, watching the city wake up. Office workers hurried under black umbrellas. Delivery trucks hissed through puddles. Everything looked ordinary, as if the night had never happened. My phone vibrated once. A short reply from my attorney. Understood. Draft will be ready by tomorrow evening. We will meet to review terms. I locked the screen and slipped the phone into my pocket. Outside, the sky was the color of diluted steel. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the weight of the last 5 hours settle. The image of Adrian's face when he saw the Ziploc bag of pills kept returning. The sudden collapse of every carefully maintained mask. The way his voice cracked when he blamed me for his own weakness. The sound of Margaret's new, soft pleading tone after years of contempt. I had spent 8 years making myself smaller so he could feel larger. I had laughed at jokes that weren't funny, stayed quiet at dinners when Margaret mocked my family, accepted the role of the invisible wife so his fragile pride would remain intact. All of it had bought me nothing except a hospital corridor at 3 a.m., and a young woman in my husband's matching pajamas. The car pulled up in front of our building in Lincoln Park. I paid the driver, stepped out into the cool morning air, and walked through the lobby without looking at anyone. The elevator rose smoothly to the 12th floor. When the doors opened, the familiar hallway smelled of polished wood and distant coffee. I pressed my thumb to the biometric lock. The deadbolt clicked. The moment the heavy oak door swung open, a small figure came flying from the living room. "Mommy!" Leela slammed into my legs with the full force of a 5-year-old who had woken up alone and then heard the key. I dropped to my knees and pulled her into my arms. Her hair smelled of the lavender shampoo I had washed it with 2 nights earlier. Her small hands locked around my neck with absolute trust. For the first time since the phone rang at 3 a.m., something inside my chest loosened. I held her tightly, kissing the top of her head, feeling the solid, living reality of her against me. This was the only thing that still made sense. This was the only person who had never asked me to shrink. Behind me, the door closed softly. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic far below. Lila pulled back, just enough to look at my face. "You were gone a long time," she said. "Did Daddy get better?" I brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Daddy is in the hospital. The doctors are taking care of him. He's going to be okay." She accepted the answer the way children do, when they trust the person speaking. I stood up, took her hand, and walked her to the kitchen. I made her scrambled eggs and toast the way she liked them, cut into small triangles. No crust. While she ate, I sat across from her and simply watched. The ordinary act of a child chewing toast felt like a miracle after the fluorescent lights and the smell of bleach and the sound of a man I had once loved begging for a second chance he did not deserve. After breakfast, I carried her to the couch, turned on a cartoon she loved, and wrapped a soft blanket around her legs. Then I went into the study, closed the door halfway, and sat at my desk. The family medical file still lay open from the night before. Adrian's driver's license sat on top of a stack of old insurance cards. I stared at his photograph for a long moment, the confident half-smile he always used for official documents. It looked like a stranger's face now. I opened my laptop and began writing a detailed timeline of the night. Every vital sign, every lab value, every statement Sienna had made, every word Margaret and Walter had spoken. I attached the photographs of the pills, the EMS dispatch notes, and the screenshots of the critical lab alerts. When the document was complete, I encrypted it and sent it to my attorney with a single sentence. This is the medical and factual record of the events of last night. Use whatever is necessary. Then I sat back and let the silence of the apartment fill the room. The next 7 days passed in a strange, controlled rhythm. I took personal leave from the institute. My colleagues assumed it was for family emergency. I did not correct them. Every morning I woke early, made Lila breakfast, took her to preschool, and returned to the empty condo. I spent hours on the phone with my lawyer, refining the terms of the divorce. Primary physical and legal custody of Lila, full ownership of the Lincoln Park condo in exchange for my agreement not to pursue public disclosure of the illegal substances or the delayed emergency call, no alimony, a clean, clinical severing. In the afternoons, I visited the hospital, only long enough to check the latest lab results on the computer system. Adrian's potassium continued to rise. His kidney function improved. The ICU notes grew steadily more optimistic. I never entered his room again. I never called. I never answered the messages Margaret left on my phone, soft, careful messages full of sudden concern for family unity and Lila's future. On the third day, I received a call from Dr. Kevin. The toxicology lab had confirmed the presence of sibutramine and high-dose loop diuretics in the capsules. He had already forwarded the report to the State Health Department and the FDA. Sienna Blake had been identified through the company directory and the hospital's visitor logs. An investigation into the delayed 911 call was under preliminary review by the district attorney's office for possible reckless endangerment. I thanked him and ended the call without emotion. Justice, if it came, would be a secondary consequence. My primary concern was the small girl who still believed her parents lived in the same house. On the fifth evening, after Lila was asleep, I sat in the reading corner with a glass of water and allowed myself to remember. I remembered the day Lila was born. The nurse placing the swaddled newborn in my arms while Margaret stared for exactly 60 seconds, then picked up her purse and walked out of the maternity ward without a word. I remembered the Thanksgiving dinners where I cooked for 12 people while Adrian and Walter drank scotch and discussed football, never once offering to clear a plate. I remembered the quiet nights when Adrian would come home late and avoid my eyes, and I would tell myself he was simply tired from work. I had been so skilled at inventing excuses for him that I had almost forgotten how to see clearly. All of that ends now, I thought. The decision was no longer emotional. It was structural. A building with a cracked foundation cannot be repaired by painting the walls. On the morning of the 8th day, the ICU attending called to say Adrian was cleared for discharge. I drove the SUV to the hospital entrance myself. The sky was clear and cold. I parked at the curb and waited with the engine running. Adrian walked out of the sliding doors holding a plastic bag of personal belongings. His face was still gaunt, the skin under his eyes shadowed. Walter and Margaret followed a few steps behind him. When they saw the car, they stopped. Margaret raised a hand in a small, uncertain wave. I did not wave back. I simply unlocked the passenger door. Adrian opened it and got in. The door closed with a soft, final sound. Walter and Margaret remained on the sidewalk as I shifted into drive and pulled away. In the rearview mirror, I watched them grow smaller until they disappeared around the corner. The silence inside the car was absolute. The only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the soft rush of air against the windows. Adrian sat with his hands locked around the plastic bag, staring straight ahead. After several blocks, he cleared his throat. Elena. I spent the whole week thinking. I blocked her number. I deleted everything. I asked for a transfer to another branch so I'll never see her again. I'll tell everyone the truth about your career. I'll do whatever you want. Just, please, give me one chance to fix this." I kept my eyes on the road. The words he spoke were the same words every man in his position eventually reaches for. Promises made in the shadow of consequence, not in the light of genuine change. I did not answer. I did not look at him. The silence stretched until it became a physical presence between us. He tried again, softer this time. "Leela needs both of us. We can go to counseling, we can start over. I know I destroyed everything, but I can rebuild it. I swear." Still I said nothing. The city moved past the windows, trees, buildings, ordinary people living ordinary mornings. I felt no anger left, only a vast, clean emptiness where the marriage used to be. When we reached the underground garage of our building, I parked in our assigned space, turned off the engine, and stepped out. Adrian followed, carrying his bag like a man walking into a courtroom. We rode the elevator in silence. At the 12th floor, I unlocked the door. The moment it opened, Lila came running again. "Mommy!" She threw herself into my arms. I knelt and held her, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. Adrian stood awkwardly near the shoe rack, watching. When Lila finally noticed him, her expression shifted into something cautious and distant. She did not run to him. She stayed pressed against my side, one small hand gripping the fabric of my coat. I stood, took her hand, and walked into the living room without inviting him to follow. On the mahogany desk in the reading corner sat a neat stack of freshly printed documents. I picked them up, returned to the living room, and placed them on the glass coffee table directly in front of the place where Adrian would have to sit if he wanted to speak to me. He stared at the papers as if they were a loaded weapon. His hands began to tremble. I looked at him, then at our daughter, then back at him. My voice was steady, almost gentle in its finality. My duty as a doctor to save your life was fully discharged at the hospital. Now it is time to exercise my right to save my own life and protect Lila's future. These are the terms. Primary custody of our daughter. You will sign your portion of the condo's equity over to me. In exchange, I will not introduce the illegal substances or the delayed emergency call into any public record or courtroom. Read them carefully. Sign them when you are ready. There will be no negotiation. Adrian's face drained of the last remaining color. He looked at the papers, then at Lila, who had already returned to her blocks on the floor, as if the adult conversation did not concern her. The absolute resolve in my eyes left him with nothing to say. The pleading that had filled the car and the hospital room finally died in his throat. I sat down on the couch beside my daughter, smoothed her hair, and watched her carefully stack one wooden block on top of another. The sunlight coming through the tall windows was clear and cold. Outside, the city continued its ordinary business. Inside, the last illusion of the life we had shared lay on the glass table between us, waiting only for a signature. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel broken. I felt only the quiet, precise clarity of a decision that had already been made in a hospital corridor at dawn and was now simply being written into paper. The marriage was over. The next chapter had already begun. Adrian stood frozen in front of the glass coffee table for a long time. The divorce papers lay between us like a clean surgical incision. He did not reach for them. He did not sit down. He simply stared, as if the printed words might rearrange themselves into something less final, if he looked hard enough. Leela continued stacking her wooden blocks on the rug, humming a soft, tuneless song under her breath. The ordinary sound of a child at play filled the silence that Adrian could not break. I remained seated on the couch, one hand resting lightly on my daughter's back, watching the careful way she balanced each block. The sunlight through the tall windows had shifted slightly, casting a sharper edge across the floor. Finally, Adrian's voice came out rough and thin. "You can't be serious. After 8 years. After everything." "I am completely serious," I said. The words were quiet, almost conversational. "You can read the documents, or you can leave them unread. The terms will not change." He took one step closer, then stopped when Lila glanced up at him with that same cautious distance she had shown at the door. He lowered his voice. "Elena, please, I know I destroyed your trust. I know what I did was unforgivable. But we have a child. We have a life. Don't throw it away because of one mistake. I looked at him then. Really looked. The man standing in our living room was still pale from the hospital, still wearing the same clothes he had been discharged in. The arrogance that had once made him believe he could hide an entire second life was gone. What remained was fear, raw and unattractive. It was not one mistake, I said. It was a pattern of lies that lasted years. It was the deliberate construction of a false identity for me, so that your ego could survive. It was the decision to take banned substances and risk your life in another woman's bed. It was the 20 minutes Sienna spent cleaning evidence while your heart was failing. That is not one mistake, that is the complete character of the man I married. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I'll do anything, counseling, separate accounts, whatever you need to feel safe again, just don't end it like this. I stood up slowly. Lila looked up at me, sensing the shift in the room. I smoothed her hair once and spoke to her first. Mommy needs to talk to Daddy for a few minutes. You can keep building your tower, okay? She nodded and returned to her blocks with the serious concentration of a child who has learned that adult conversations are sometimes heavy. I walked to the far side of the living room, putting the length of the sofa between Adrian and myself. There is nothing left to rebuild, I told him. The foundation was already cracked long before last night. I simply refused to see it clearly. That refusal ends now. He reached for the papers at last, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. I watched the color drain further from his face as he read the custody terms, the property division, the clause regarding silence on the medical and criminal aspects of the night. When he reached the final page, he looked up. You're taking everything. I am taking what is necessary to protect Lila and to recover the life I set aside for you, I corrected. You keep your income, your career, your freedom. You lose the ability to continue using me as a mirror for your insecurity. That is not everything. That is the minimum required for both of us to move forward. He sank onto the edge of the armchair as if his legs would no longer hold him. For several minutes, the only sounds were Leela's soft humming and the distant traffic far below. Then Adrian's shoulders began to shake. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and cried without sound. I did not move toward him. I did not offer comfort. The time for that had ended in a hospital room under fluorescent lights. When the crying slowed, he wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt and spoke in a broken voice. I need time. At least give me a few days to process this. You have until the end of the week, I said. After that, the papers will be filed whether you have signed them or not. My attorney is prepared for either path. He nodded once, defeated, and stood. He walked to the guest bedroom at the end of the hall without another word, carrying the plastic hospital bag, like a man who no longer belonged in his own home. The door closed softly behind him. I returned to the couch and sat beside Lila. She climbed into my lap without being asked and rested her head against my shoulder. We stayed like that for a long time, watching the afternoon light move across the floor. The next 3 days passed in a careful, almost ritual silence. Adrian remained in the guest room. He left early each morning and returned late, never attempting another conversation. I heard him on the phone once, his voice low and urgent, but I did not listen to the words. Whatever he was arranging, apology tours, new living arrangements, attempts to rally his parents, no longer concerned me. Margaret called 6 times on the second day. I let every call go to voicemail. On the 7th attempt I answered. Her voice was careful, almost sweet. Elena, darling, we need to talk as a family. Walter and I are devastated by all of this. Adrian is broken. Please don't make a permanent decision while emotions are still high. Think of Lila. Children need both parents under the same roof. I listened without interruption until she finished. Then I spoke in the same even tone I had used with hospital staff. Margaret, the decision is already permanent. Lila will have both parents in her life. She will simply no longer have them living in the same house under a structure built on lies. If you wish to remain part of her life, you will respect the boundaries I am setting. If you cannot, that is your choice. There was a long silence on the other end. When Margaret spoke again, the sweetness had thinned. You're being cruel. After everything you did, I interrupted quietly. After the day you walked out of the maternity ward. After years of treating me as an inconvenience who had trapped your son. After enabling the very culture of entitlement that led him to believe he could risk everything for a 22-year-old's attention. I am not being cruel. I am simply no longer participating in the fiction. I ended the call before she could reply. Walter tried next, his approach different, measured, almost academic. He spoke of the importance of legacy, of the Kane name, of the damaged public divorce would do to Adrian's career. I answered him with the same clarity. Walter, the only legacy I am concerned with is the one Lila inherits. She will inherit a mother who refused to stay in a marriage that required her to disappear. That is the example I choose to give her. Everything else is secondary. He did not call again. On the fourth evening, I sat with Lila at the small table in the kitchen, while she colored a picture of a house with a bright yellow sun. I had already spoken with a child psychologist recommended by a colleague, and I followed the guidance carefully. Mommy and Daddy are going to live in different houses, I told her simply. You will still see both of us. You will still have two people who love you very much. Nothing about how much we love you is going to change. She looked up from her coloring, crayon paused in midair. Will I still have my room? Yes, your room stays exactly the same. And when you visit Daddy, you will have a room there too. She considered this for a moment, then returned to coloring. Okay. The acceptance of a 5-year-old is sometimes the cleanest thing in the world. She did not ask why. She did not demand explanations she was not ready to carry. She simply adjusted the shape of her world and continued drawing the sun. That night, after she was asleep, I stood in the doorway of the master bedroom and looked at the space Adrian and I had shared. The bed was neatly made. His side of the closet still held the suits he had worn to the office, the ties arranged by color. I walked to the closet, took out a single empty suitcase, and began packing the clothes he would need in the immediate future. I worked methodically, without anger, folding each item with the same precision I used when preparing surgical instruments. When the suitcase was full, I left it outside the guest room door. The following morning, Adrian emerged while I was making coffee. He looked at the suitcase, then at me. His face was hollow. You're really doing this? I already did, I answered. The papers are still on the table. My attorney will be here at 2 o'clock this afternoon to witness the signatures if you are ready. If you are not, she will file without them. He nodded once. For the first time, there was no further pleading in his eyes. Only the flat recognition of a man who had finally reached the end of every argument he could invent. At 2 o'clock my attorney arrived. A calm, precise woman named Rachel, who had handled more high-conflict professional divorces than most people experience in a lifetime. She sat at the dining table, reviewed the documents one final time, and then looked at Adrian. Mr. Kane, these terms are fair and final. You have the right to independent counsel. If you wish to delay, we can reschedule. If you are prepared to sign, we proceed today. Adrian sat across from her, the papers in front of him. He read the final page again, though he already knew every word. Then he picked up the pen. His hand trembled only once before he signed his name in 3 places. Rachel notarized each signature with efficient calm. When it was finished, she gathered the documents into a slim folder and stood. I'll file these first thing tomorrow morning, she told me. You'll receive confirmation by end of day. I walked her to the door. When I returned to the living room, Adrian was still seated at the table, staring at the empty space where the papers had been. Lila came running in from her room, holding a drawing she wanted to show me. I knelt to look at it, praising the bright colors and the careful lines. Behind me, I heard Adrian rise and walk toward the guest room. A few minutes later, he left the apartment carrying the suitcase I had packed. The door closed with a soft, ordinary sound. I remained on the floor with Leela for a long time, listening to her explain the story behind her drawing. The afternoon light had grown golden. The city continued its usual rhythm far below. Inside the apartment, the air felt different, lighter, as if a pressure that had existed for years had finally been released. That evening, I cooked dinner the way Lila liked it, and we ate together at the small kitchen table. Afterward, I bathed her, read her 2 stories, and sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing slowed into sleep. Then I walked through the quiet apartment and began the slow process of reclaiming space. I removed Adrian's remaining clothes from the master closet and placed them in boxes for later delivery. I changed the locks on the biometric system so that only my fingerprint and Lila's emergency code would open the door. I stood for a moment in the center of the living room and simply breathed. For the first time in 8 years, the silence in the apartment belonged entirely to me. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and wrote a short email to the director of the National Heart Institute. I informed him that I would be returning to full duties the following Monday and that I wished to update my professional biography on the Institute's website to reflect my complete credentials without any remaining omissions. The reply came within the hour, a simple, warm confirmation. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. The city lights stretched out beneath me, clear and distant. Somewhere in that same city, Sienna, Blake was likely discovering that the investigation into the delayed emergency call was moving forward. Somewhere, Adrian was sitting with the reality of the signature he had placed on those pages. None of it reached me here. I turned away from the window, checked on Lila one last time, and went to bed in a room that no longer contained anyone else's expectations. The papers had been signed. The old life had been cut away with clean precision. What remained was mine to build. The first Monday after the papers were filed, I returned to the National Heart Institute at the usual hour. The glass doors of the research wing recognized my badge with the same soft click they always had. Inside, the corridors smelled of coffee and sterilized air. Colleagues nodded as I passed. A few offered brief, professional greetings. No one asked about the week I had been gone. In this building, privacy was still respected. I walked into my office on the 7th floor, set my bag down, and opened the blinds. The city stretched out below in the clear morning light. On my desk sat the updated institutional biography that the communications team had prepared over the weekend. I read it once. Every credential was listed without omission. Elena Voss, MD, PhD, Chief of Cardiology Research. The language was precise and complete. I approved it with a single digital signature and closed the file. For 8 years I had allowed a quieter, smaller version of myself to exist outside these walls. That version was gone. The woman who sat at this desk now matched the one who had issued orders in a trauma bay at 3 a.m. The alignment felt clean. At noon I left early to pick Lila up from preschool. She ran across the playground with her usual full-speed abandon and threw her arms around my waist. In the car she talked about a painting she had made and a boy who had shared his crackers. I listened, asking the small questions that keep a child's world intact. At a red light she suddenly said, "Daddy's house has different pillows." I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Different can be okay. Your room at Daddy's will feel like yours too, once you put your things there. She considered this, then nodded and returned to describing the painting. Children absorb change in pieces. I had learned not to force the whole picture on her at once. The custody schedule had begun the previous Friday. Adrian picked Lila up at 5:00 p.m. and returned her Sunday at 5 p.m. The exchanges took place at the building entrance. We did not speak beyond the necessary logistics. He looked thinner. He did not attempt conversation. I did not offer any. When Lila's small suitcase transferred from one adult hand to the other, the transaction remained brief and civil. That was all I required. On the second Sunday evening, after Lila was asleep, I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea and opened the encrypted folder my attorney had sent. Inside were the final filed documents, the property transfer records, and a short note confirming that the Lincoln Park condo now stood solely in my name. I read each page carefully, then closed the folder. the legal structure of the old marriage had been dismantled with the same precision used to close a surgical incision. What remained was functional and clear. Margaret called once more that week. I answered because Lila was at preschool and the apartment was quiet. "Elena," she began, her voice carefully measured, "Walter and I have been talking. We understand you're angry. We understand you feel betrayed. But families recover from these things. Adri is willing to do whatever it takes. We're willing to help with Lila, with the house, with anything. Please don't shut the door completely." I waited until she finished. Then I spoke without heat. "The door was never open in the way you believed it was. For 8 years I stood inside a structure that required me to stay silent about my own work, to accept criticism of my background, and to protect a version of your son that did not exist. That structure is gone. I will not rebuild it. Lila will continue to see her grandparents if you can respect the boundaries that now exist. If you cannot, the contact will be limited. That is not punishment. That is the new reality." Margaret was silent for several seconds. When she spoke again, the careful tone had frayed. "You're making a mistake you'll regret when Lila is older and asks why her family fell apart." "If Lila asks," I said, "I will tell her the truth appropriate for her age. That her parents decided they could no longer live in the same house, and that both of them still love her. The rest is not her burden to carry." I ended the call. She did not call again. 2 weeks later, Dr. Kevin contacted me with an update. The toxicology results had been forwarded to the FDA and the State Medical Board. A formal investigation into the distribution of the sibutramine-laced capsules was underway. Sienna Blake had been interviewed. She had initially denied supplying the pills, then changed her statement when presented with the chain of custody documentation and the EMS timeline. The district attorney's office was reviewing the 20-minute delay in the 911 call for possible charges of reckless endangerment. Whether prosecution would follow was still uncertain, but the file was no longer buried. I thanked Dr. Kevin for the information and returned to my work. The legal consequences for Sienna and the illegal suppliers were necessary, but they were no longer the center of my attention. My attention belonged to the small girl who still woke some nights and called for me, and to the research protocols that required my full presence again. In the evenings, after Lila was asleep, I began the slower work of sorting the physical remnants of the marriage. I went through boxes of photographs, removing the ones that no longer belonged on the shelves. I did not destroy them. I simply placed them in a single labeled container and stored it in the back of a closet. The act was neither dramatic nor sentimental. It was administrative. The past had weight. It did not need to occupy the visible surfaces of the present. One night I found a small notebook from the early years of the marriage. Inside were lists I had written in careful handwriting. Groceries, birthday gifts for Adrian's parents, reminders to downplay a recent publication so that dinner conversations would not make him uncomfortable. I read 3 pages and then closed the notebook. The woman who had written those lists had believed that shrinking herself was a form of love. I no longer shared that belief. I placed the notebook in the same container as the photographs. The weeks settled into a new rhythm. Mornings belonged to Lila and to the quiet logistics of school and breakfast. Days belonged to the institute. Meetings, data review, the ongoing clinical trials that had always been the true center of my professional life. Evenings belonged again to Lila. Dinner, bath, stories, the small conversations that accumulate into a child's sense of safety. On the nights she stayed with Adrian, the apartment felt larger and quieter. I used those hours to work, to read, or simply to sit by the window and let the city move beneath me, without requiring anything in return. I did not feel triumphant. Triumph would have implied a contest I had needed to win. What I felt instead was a steady, low-grade clarity. The decisions made in the fluorescent light of the hospital corridor had been correct. The signature on the divorce papers had simply made them permanent. The life that remained was smaller in some ways. No more performances at family dinners, no more careful omissions about my title, and larger in others. I no longer measured my words against someone else's ego. I no longer calculated how much of myself I could safely display. One Saturday afternoon, I took Lila to the park near the lake. The air was cool and bright. She ran ahead on the path, then waited for me to catch up, her small hand finding mine without looking. We sat on a bench and watched the water. After a while, she leaned against my side and said, "Mommy, are you happy?" The question was simple and enormous. I considered it the way I considered clinical data, carefully, without rushing to a convenient answer. "I'm becoming someone I recognize again," I told her. "That feels like the right direction." She seemed satisfied. Children often are, when the adults around them speak without the extra layer of performance. On the drive home, she fell asleep in her car seat, head tilted against the side, mouth slightly open. I parked in the garage, carried her upstairs, and settled her on the couch with a blanket. Then I stood in the center of the living room and looked around. The space no longer held the shape of a shared life that had required constant adjustment. It held only what belonged to the two of us now. I walked to the desk in the reading corner, opened my laptop, and began drafting the outline for a new research proposal I had been considering for months. The work absorbed me the way it always had, completely, without the background noise of someone else's unresolved needs. When I finally looked up, the light outside had shifted toward evening. Lila stirred on the couch, then settled again. I saved the document, closed the laptop, and went to the kitchen to start dinner. The ordinary sequence of tasks, chopping vegetables, setting a small plate, calling Lila to the table, felt steady and sufficient. No one required me to be less than I was in order to keep the evening intact. Later, after she was in bed, I stood once more at the window. The city lights were sharp and distant. Somewhere out there, the investigation into the black market pills continued. Somewhere, Adrian was living the consequences of the choices he had made. None of it required my further participation. My participation had ended the moment I placed the signed papers in my attorney's hands and changed the locks on the door. What remained was simpler and stronger than what had come before. It was a life that no longer asked me to disappear in order to be loved. It was a daughter who still reached for my hand without hesitation. It was work that demanded the full range of my training and gave something measurable in return. I turned away from the window, checked on Lila one last time, and went to bed. Sleep came without the old weight of unspoken calculations. In the morning, the routine would begin again. Preschool, the institute, the quiet logistics of a life that finally matched the woman living it. The sleepless night had done its work. The shape of what remained was mine to keep. 4 months after the night the phone rang at 3:00 a.m., the city had moved fully into late autumn. The trees along the lake path had turned sharp shades of copper and deep red. The air carried the first consistent chill of the season. I walked that path most Saturday mornings now, sometimes alone, sometimes with Lila's small hand in mine. The routine had become one of the quiet anchors of the life that remained. On this particular Saturday, the sky was clear and high. Lila ran a few steps ahead, then circled back, her scarf trailing behind her like a bright flag. She had grown taller since the summer. Her questions had grown more precise as well. The previous evening she had asked, with the seriousness only a 5-year-old can manage, whether Daddy still lived in the same city. I had answered yes. She had nodded, accepted the information, and returned to her coloring book. The exchanges of information between us had become simpler and cleaner. There was no longer a second adult in the house, whose mood required constant monitoring. We stopped at the usual bench overlooking the water. Lila climbed up beside me and leaned against my side the way she always did when she wanted quiet rather than conversation. I watched the light move across the surface of the lake and allowed the months to settle into a single, coherent picture. The divorce had been finalized 6 weeks earlier. The court documents arrived by secure email on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing trial data at the institute. I read them once, filed them in the encrypted folder that now contained the entire legal record, and returned to the spreadsheet open on my second monitor. There was no ceremony. There was only the clean administrative fact that the marriage no longer existed in any legal sense. Adrian had moved into a smaller apartment on the north side. The custody exchanges continued at the building entrance every Friday and Sunday. He looked better than he had in the weeks immediately after the hospital, less hollow, more composed. He still did not attempt conversation beyond the necessary. I preferred it that way. Whatever internal reckoning he was conducting belonged entirely to him. I no longer carried any responsibility for the state of his conscience. Margaret and Walter had made 2 further attempts at contact in the early months. Both had been formal, almost stilted emails proposing family mediation and expressing concern for Lila's long-term emotional health. I replied to each with the same short paragraph. Lila was thriving, the custody schedule was stable, and further discussion of the marriage itself was neither necessary nor welcome. After the second reply, they stopped writing. I did not interpret the silence as acceptance. I interpreted it as the recognition that the previous hierarchy no longer functioned. That was sufficient. The investigation into the black market capsules and the delayed emergency call had moved at the deliberate pace of institutional process. Sienna Blake had been formally charged with reckless endangerment. The case was still pending. Plea negotiations were reportedly underway. The FDA had issued a public warning about the specific batch of sibutramine-laced diet pills that had circulated through certain online channels. None of these developments required my further involvement. I received occasional updates from Dr. Kevin as a professional courtesy. I read them, acknowledged them, and closed the messages. The legal consequences were proceeding without me. Exactly as they should. What occupied my attention instead was the steady reconstruction of ordinary life. At the Institute, my full credentials now appeared on every internal directory and external biography without omission. Colleagues who had known me for years simply adjusted. A few senior researchers made quiet sense of respect about the clarity of the correction. Most said nothing at all. The work itself remained the constant. Protocol design, data integrity, the long arc of clinical questions that had always mattered more than any domestic performance. At home, the apartment had taken on a different texture. The guest room stayed empty, except for the nights Lily's cousins or a visiting colleague used it. The master closet contained only my clothes and the small section reserved for Lily's overflow. The biometric lock recognized 2 fingerprints and no others. These were small facts, yet each one reinforced the larger truth that the space no longer required constant negotiation. One evening in early November, I sat at the desk in the reading corner after Leela was asleep and opened the old notebook I had stored away months earlier. I turned the pages slowly. The lists were still there, reminders to soften the language around a new publication, notes about gifts that might please Margaret, careful calculations of how much professional success could be safely mentioned at dinner without disturbing the balance of Adrian's mood. I read them without the heat of fresh anger. The woman who had written those lists had believed that love required the continuous management of another person's fragility. I no longer held that belief. I closed the notebook and returned it to the container at the back of the closet. Some records are kept not for nostalgia, but for evidence of distance traveled. Lila's adjustment continued in the incremental way children adjust. She still asked occasional questions. She still preferred her own bed on school nights. She still ran to me first when she scraped a knee or needed a story explained. On the Sundays she returned from Adrian's apartment, she sometimes carried a small new toy or a drawing she had made there. She showed them to me without tension. The 2 households existed side by side in her mind as simply as 2 different playgrounds. That separation of emotional space was the clearest sign that the decision made in the hospital corridor had been correct for her as well as for me. I thought often about the night itself. The fluorescent lights, the smell of bleach, the sound of Margaret's voice rising in the hallway, the exact moment the lab results appeared on my phone screen in red. The medical facts had been straightforward once the data was visible. The human facts had taken longer to accept in full. For years, I had treated Adrian's insecurity as something I could manage through careful omission. I had treated Margaret's contempt as something that could be endured for the sake of family continuity. I had treated my own silence as a form of strength. The 3 a.m. call had simply removed the possibility of continuing those particular fictions. What replaced them was not dramatic liberation. It was something quieter and more durable, the ability to occupy my own life without constant internal translation. I no longer edited my speech before speaking. I no longer measured the size of my accomplishments against the comfort of someone else's ego. I no longer calculated how much of myself could be safely visible. The absence of those calculations left a great deal of mental space. I used it for work, for Lila, and for the ordinary maintenance of a life that finally matched the person living it. On a Thursday evening near the end of November, I stayed late at the Institute to finalize a grant submission. The research wing was nearly empty. The only sounds were the low hum of the climate system and the occasional distant elevator. I sat at my desk with the final document open, reading each section for precision one last time. When I finished, I submitted the file and sat for a moment in the quiet. The city lights outside the window were sharp and numerous. I felt no urgency to leave, and no residual sense that someone at home required an explanation for the hour. The freedom was structural rather than emotional. It simply existed. I drove home through light traffic, parked in the garage, and took the elevator up. Lila was already asleep. The sitter I used on late nights had left a short note on the counter. I checked on my daughter, smoothed the blanket over her shoulder, and then walked through the apartment, turning off lights. In the living room, I paused at the glass coffee table. The surface was clear. No documents waited there. No unresolved conversations hung in the air. The room held only the ordinary objects of a life in progress. I made a cup of tea and sat by the window for a while without turning on the lamp. The darkness outside was soft. The reflection of the room behind me was faint and calm. I thought about the original story I had once lived, the one in which I had believed that protecting a man's pride was a form of loyalty, and that enduring quiet contempt was the price of belonging to a family. That story had ended in a hospital hallway under harsh fluorescent light. The story that replaced it was still being written, but its first chapters already felt truer. Forgiveness, I had learned, did not require remaining inside a structure that demanded self-erasure. Sometimes the most precise form of care for one's own life was the decision to leave. The night Adrian collapsed had forced every hidden fracture into view. Once the fractures were visible, the only rational response was to stop pretending the foundation was sound. I finished the tea, rinsed the cup, and went to bed. Sleep came the way it had for months now, without the old undercurrent of calculation. In the morning Lila would wake, and the ordinary sequence of the day would begin again. Breakfast, preschool, the institute, the return home, the small conversations that accumulate into a child's sense of continuity. None of those tasks required me to be less than I was. The following Saturday we returned to the lake path. The trees had lost more of their leaves. The water looked colder and clearer. Lila ran ahead, then waited, then ran again. At the bench she climbed up and leaned against me in the familiar way. After a few minutes of silence she said, "Mommy, I like our house." I rested my hand on her hair. "I like it too." She seemed content with the answer. We sat until the wind grew sharper, then walked back toward the car. On the drive home she fell asleep in her seat, head tilted, mouth slightly open. I parked, carried her upstairs, and settled her on the couch with a blanket while I made lunch. The apartment was quiet, except for the low sounds of the city far below and the soft rhythm of her breathing. I stood for a moment in the center of the living room and simply looked at the space. It no longer contained the shape of a marriage that had required constant adjustment. It contained only what belonged to the two of us now, and the open possibility of whatever would come next. The sleepless night had done its necessary work. It had stripped away every remaining illusion. What remained was clearer, stronger, and entirely mine to keep. I turned toward the kitchen and began preparing the simple meal my daughter would wake to. Outside, the afternoon light continued its ordinary passage across the city. Inside, the life that had begun in the harsh clarity of a hospital corridor at dawn continued, steady and unbroken, into the ordinary hours that followed. The story of that night was finished. The life that came after it had only just begun.